Hello and welcome everybody to our Managing Behaviour Q&A. There's been lots of really good questions come in. Let me first introduce myself a little bit. I am Paul Thornton, who is the Network Education Lead at STEM Learning. Prior to this role, I was Assistant Head Teacher at a school in South Tyneside, and I was responsible for behaviour. So I am excited to feedback my experience to some of these questions. Tanya?
Hi, yes, my name's Tanya Shields and I'm the Primary STEM Lead at STEM Learning. Like Paul, worked in a senior leadership role within a primary school, responsible for managing behaviour and working with trainee teachers to support them develop their behaviour management strategies in a primary classroom.
Brilliant. Okay, so we had lots of questions come in around low-level disruption, and I'm just going to pick out one from Ellie, who says, what tools can we use for managing low-level disruption? Quiet whispering when others are talking, playing with equipment in front of them, staring out of windows at other students. Yeah, this was always one that I was asked about when I was leading behaviour. The first thing I would say is that teachers can sometimes ruin their own lessons by paying too much attention to it. And what I mean by that is, stopping the learning for everyone for a few minutes and focusing on that one student or two students who are doing the low-level behaviour, shouting across the classroom very often at them, and that is more likely to cause others to go off task. So the three main techniques I try to often ask my staff to adopt was one, non-verbal communication, two, like having personal words or follow-up with the student outside of the learning environment or within the learning environment, but not at that point. And the third one is an all eyes on me approach, where you want 100% of the student's attention. And I'll just elaborate a little bit on those things. So for non-verbal communication, you continue your teaching as much as possible, and you do certain techniques to stop the students who are having the low-level disruption do it without you stopping your teaching. So you would walk towards the students, for instance, that is doing the low-level disruption. You would make a eye contact or facial change, just so that you don't interrupt the learning of others. You continue, but the people who are doing the low-level disruption know that you are aware of it and that you're walking towards them. The personal word is at the right time within the lesson, perhaps when the students are on task. You approach the desk quietly, and you ask that student to explain their behaviour and start to give reasons of why it was important that they should have been listening at that point. But never make a huge deal of it, because often that's what some of these students are craving. They're craving that audience. And the last one, in terms of 100% attention, all eyes on me, you should stand and wait for attention. You shouldn't try and teach when there's lots of small discussions going on. And this is something you'll have to build up over time. Like most behaviour strategies, you have to build this up over time, and students will be aware of what you're doing. But it's a kind of saying, as people are turning and listening, you're praising that. You're saying things like, well done, we've got 5, 6 people looking now, we've got 7 people looking now. And what you start to then do is, we're waiting on 3, we're waiting on 2. You know who you are, and you're not picking out anyone, because again, we don't want them to have the stage, but they know, well, I'm not listening, so I must be one of those 2. And in fact, sometimes when there's more than 2, they think they're in the 2. So they'll start looking around in anyway. And you just wait for the whole class to have all eyes on you before you start the teaching. And lots of these techniques are from a book called Teach Like a Champion. So if you do want any more information on that, then check that book out, Teach Like a Champion. Do you have anything else to say on that one, Tanya?
Yeah, I think the point that you made at the beginning, it's always that judgment call, isn't it, about actually when you should intervene. If the child who is misbehaving, that low level lack of attention, if it's not disrupting the rest of the learners in the classroom, so you have to make that call as to whether, do I carry on with the learning and teach to the other 29 children in the class, or do I actually deal with that one level? And I remember, particularly with primary children, you do get that telltelling mentality, like so-and-so's doing this, so-and-so's tapping this. And quite often, if you have got that child that is tapping or fiddling, it might be because they need to do that. That's part of their way of coping with the classroom environment. So actually you don't want to stop that child from tapping or doing that thing that's irritating somebody else. So you're almost trying to teach the other children to cope with how other people learn. So maybe saying to the children, is it stopping you from learning? And if it's not, then can you manage to try and ignore it? And then we can carry on with the lesson. But yes, as you've said, all the strategies that you've put out there, they work brilliantly with the primary classroom, and particularly that positive comments about, oh, do you know what? So-and-so on that table sat brilliantly. And with primary children, you often see that the arms go folding, and I'm sat nicely too. So it's almost a catalyst, isn't it, of positive behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And so the next one is around positive climate for learning. And David had a question. What do you recommend for working with students who have a specific gift, a great potential in a certain area or field, who can do one thing very well but behave very strangely, or are not very well liked by other students, sometimes dominant ones? How can one work with praise in the class so that there's a positive effect on the mutual understanding and the atmosphere, the respect for such special students? Or is this the completely wrong way or place of doing it? Yeah, first and foremost, I think knowing that person and what they will appreciate is really key. And again, I go back to the point, this isn't a quick fix. It's over time, building relationships and being consistent with something. Everyone is different. I would never say strange. Everyone is different, and it's about building up their self-esteem and trying to make the classroom as inclusive as possible. And that's the long-term goal, but it may take small steps. So if you know that they don't like being praised in front of the class, then do it privately. Do it away from the classroom, and just say that what you did there yesterday was fantastic. And they know that you appreciate what they did, but they don't feel that that awkwardness that they might feel within the class. If you're doing group work with and identify members of class that are helpful, so you know that which members of class will really work well with that student. So anytime you do group work, get them in that group and start to be inclusive that way. Try and really find out about that student, what their hobbies are, what the interests are, and bring them to the attention of like-minded individuals. So, oh, you're really interested in horse riding, and you can almost bring people together that way and start that relationship building. If and when they want to talk, because very often sometimes they have low self-esteem and don't want to, express themselves too often. And when they do want to, it's a case of a 100% listening to them. You really need to give them everything at that point, because you may never get another chance with that. So yeah, that's what I would say on that. Other than, be thorough with it, small steps over time to that long-term goal of being an inclusive classroom. Tanya?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you there. It is relationships. I wonder whether in the primary classroom it might be easier to implement this, because you do have your class together. So those children have probably moved up with that individual and accept that individual for who they are and how they work. And I think you're absolutely, in secondary, it is going to be more challenging, because you've got children coming from different schools and might not understand that. My view would be that you're teaching the other students in your class, the other children in your class, to accept that we are all different and we are all working differently. And as long as we're not impacting on each other's learning, then actually we should accept that and accept that we are all different and work differently.
Okay, we're moving on now to a question around assertiveness. And we had a very similar question from Jacqueline, Rena, and Tracy. The question is, I'm quite a calm person in the classroom and don't suffer with emotional outbursts often described here. If anything, I feel I'm not assertive enough. Are there any tips for me to increase my presence in the classroom? Firstly, in my experience, and what I would say is, quiet and calm is better than loud and irrational. A lot of teachers' barks are worse than their bite. And within time, they would have lost the respect of their pupils if they continue to shout and go and follow through with things. Students will then actually start to push the buttons of those teachers, because they like the sound of their bark, if you like. So what students really need to learn is that your bite is worse than your bark, and that you're going to be consistent and relentlessly persistent in following through with things. So if you see you're going to do something, then what you must do is you must do it, and you must do it every single time without fail. If you don't, they will start to take threats as what they are, just threats. And so you really need to follow through with that. It may take time, but they will come to the understanding that this teacher will follow up. So I best follow the instructions that they are giving me. And, you know, a bit of disclaimer on that, I suppose that's for most pupils. We all know that there are some students that possibly wouldn't work for. I often think, and I go back to the first question, that body language is really important. It can often be more impactful than using language. So work on your assertiveness through your body language if your voice doesn't travel. And again, teach like a champion. Great thing to look at to look at the strategies that would work if your voice doesn't travel, and the assertiveness you can do through body language and techniques. Yeah. Tanya?
Yeah, this question reminds me of when I first started teaching. We had what we call a lively class. We had a lively year group, and one of the children he'd overstepped the mark and was being sent to the head teacher. And I overheard a conversation with his friend. His friend turned round and said to him, "Oh, don't worry about it. She'll just stand there. She'll just shout at you. Just ignore her and it'll be over and done with. And then you can come back to the classroom." And for me, that was a really, really poignant point, that actually, you know, children figure this stuff out quite quickly. And you don't have to be a shouty, loud, aggressive person in order to be assertive. And it never was my style to be able to shout and rule with an iron rod, as it were. It was the relationship really came into play there, because if the children know a little bit about you and like you, then actually a glare from you or a look of disappointment from you is far more powerful than somebody bawling and screaming at them with no impact, really. So I would say be honest about your personality, and you find your own way of dealing things, and don't look at other people's techniques and think that they're going to work for you. It's trial and error, and stick to what you're good at, because that'll be what makes a difference.
Brilliant. That leads really nicely on to the next question, which is all around teaching in class used to another teacher's approaches, and therefore inconsistency amongst the teaching staff. So we've got a few questions on that. So I'm going to look at Karen's. Karen says, as a trainee, I was taking over other teachers' classes. If a class is used to being continually shouted at by the teacher and doing nothing but textbook work, how do I follow that style of teaching, as it is so different to how I want to teach? Okay, so firstly, what I would say is never try to emulate another teacher's style, as Tanya's just said. It will become apparent very quickly to the students that you're fake, and it'll just not be natural. You should always try and have a natural style of teaching that suits your personality. But what you can do is obviously pick out the good techniques from the teachers you're observing and almost put them into your toolbox for you to use. But never try and emulate someone's style within a classroom. Secondly, I think often this technique is adopted by students to see if they, you know, there's another question in there that mentions around a teacher wouldn't do it that way. My teacher wouldn't do it that way. So secondly, often it's adopted by students for you to lower your standards. So they'll play teachers off against each other very often. So they'll say, you know, Mr. Dixon lets me put my headphones on when I do coursework. So then Mr. Armstrong thinks, well, Mr. Dixon's fairly senior. I'll let my students put their headphones in, and then the standards drop a little bit, and it almost spreads across school. What I would say is ignore what they're saying. If other teachers are doing that, that's their issue. Very often they're not. It's just a way of the students, you know, playing you a little bit. What I would say is just follow the school policy. Inform teachers that if students are saying those things, that they are saying those things, so that the teacher knows, and do it in humorous ways, that you're not accusing them, but just so everyone's aware of what students are saying around school around that. But the bigger issue here is a common one. So consistency of staff to follow the policy. And again, this is not particularly for an individual to solve. This is senior leadership. This is about the behaviour lead and the head teacher to ensure that everyone is following the same policy, regardless of the background of that teacher, regardless of the personalities. and the views, because there'll be lots of different backgrounds and personalities and views from the teachers, and they'll always try and approach situations differently, but what they shouldn't change is the policy, and that's the thing that keeps that consistency. And from a senior leader point of view, the policy needs to be as simple and as clear as possible in order for staff to be able to follow it efficiently. And you know, best practice is often shared by having the open classroom. So what we try to do is have open classrooms and see how other staff do it, where the best practice is, and then staff who consistently don't follow the policies are you know, asked to go and have a look at how it's done. And you know, if they are not then following policies after that, then it is up to the senior leadership to work with that staff member to get them to start following the policy as they should. Lastly, I would say from a teacher's point of view, follow the policy calmly, without emotion. That's always important. Regardless of what students think of you, you know, you're part of that bigger team, and you need to be doing things as a team rather than as an individual. Yeah, that's everything from me.
Yeah, this reminds me of when I was doing my teacher training, and it was a really powerful learning point that our lecturer had said to us about the behaviour of the children in the classroom, and they said, how the children behave in your classroom is your responsibility. To which I challenged and said, well, what happens if a child's at home and has not a particularly nice home life, where it's commonplace for them to use poor language, to be abusive towards each other, whether that might be mentally or physically, where children have that common standard of behaviour at home? How can I be responsible for actually changing that or being responsible for that in my classroom? And the lecturer was very clear and said, when they come into your classroom, when they come through that door, they must know that your rules apply to that classroom, and it's your responsibility to enforce it. So regardless of what's going on at home, I know that you're having a tough time at home, but in my classroom, this is what I expect the behaviour to be. And this, if you can't abide by that, then this is when the sanctions come into place. And it took me a while to actually understand that, but actually with experience, you do find that, yes, this is my classroom. And actually for children, it's a really comforting and secure place to know that these are what the boundaries are, and these are going to be consistent and going to be, and it doesn't happen overnight. And I'm not saying that my classrooms were perfect. They were far from perfect. But that consistency and trying to keep that level head and having your own systems in place is really key to making sure that your children know what to expect and how they're expected to behave. And if you've got the policy in there as well, and if the whole school are doing it, then that's when you see real dividends from these approaches.
Yeah, brilliant. We're moving on to the next question around school leadership, and I have just answered some of them in that last one. But Amita says, how do I ensure that my staff takes on the responsibility to follow the rules and routines to manage behaviour and actually handle the situation themselves? They tend to bring all the problem cases to me, saying, I told him, but he won't listen, and then leave it on my plate to handle. It becomes too much for me sometimes, but I can't walk away from the problem, but they do walk away from the problem. Okay, so as I said, I've answered some of the previous question around policy and people following the policy and having their own classroom management techniques before they go into the policies. But what I think what's quite apt in that question is the bit around they pass the book and they basically say, you deal with them. So what my advice in terms of that, and what I always ask my staff to do was, if you are getting others involved and you are still involved, you know, you're almost working as a team now. So in terms of the book being passed, if you like, don't allow that member of staff just to walk off. They should stay and speak with the student with you, and you should together try and build that relationship back up. So if it was me and a member of staff, and I know that I've had the conversation with the child that she just doesn't like me or we just don't get on, and what I would always do is make that member of staff stay with me and try and get them to talk it through, with me being a bit of a facilitator. Whereas therefore the book isn't being passed. You are doing your bit, but it's also trying to build that relationship, that relationship up at the same time. Tanya, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, this isn't about the children, is it? It's about building your staff, and that's how you actually support your staff to develop. And those coaching conversations where it might not be where the child's present, but saying to them, okay, so we have this issue where you've got the child in the classroom. What are we aiming for here? Is it acceptable for that child to constantly be out of the classroom? And actually trying, almost setting a kind of action plan with the teacher themselves to actually implement it, and then coming back to it. So you're almost teaching the teacher and how to work in the classroom. And I know that they said here that no amount of training, feedback, performance and appraisal seems to make any difference. But they have a responsibility to do their job in the classroom. And I think with a child, you wouldn't give up. You would keep putting those small steps in place. And maybe that's what you need to do with a teacher, of the small steps of these are the successes, and almost, right, you've had a good week with this child and nobody's had to come and see me, and so on. It's not what we expect when we're working with adults, but sometimes those are the steps that we have to take to make sure that our staff are all on board with what they need to be doing in the classroom.
Yeah, and if I just want to add one more point to it as well, just around the idea of they're passing it over to you. They obviously think that you are very capable of doing that, and perhaps they feel like you may be doing a better job. And they know that you're going to deal with the situation because you always have done, you always will do. And they may not know that it's too much for you. So maybe there is a conversation to be had with that member of staff, just to say, you know, sometimes I don't feel I can, support it every time. And just make them understand that sometimes it's a team effort rather than just passing it to me all of the time. Lovely. Okay, so the next question is around cover teachers and support. I think it's linked slightly to the question before, but Vicky says, I am a support for learning teacher at present, although occasionally have to cover classes for absent teachers. Can you please give me advice as to how to best tackle challenge behaviour when I have limited time with the class? So little relationship with them, and the class routines are not familiar to me, nor are the children familiar with any of my routines. Okay, it's a great question, and it's a really tough one because I haven't had that experience personally. But I think it's very similar to NQTs, in that when they're trying to set up their sort of strategies when they first come in, and new teachers when you come in school. And I've certainly seen supply teachers come in and struggle with students within the in-school environment. But I've also seen supply teachers come in and really hit it off with the students. And I think the best thing to do in that situation, you're right, the routine and the long-lasting routines and personal relationships you can build up is not there. So the first thing I think is important is to make yourself human as quickly as possible. So, you know, introduce yourself and what you like, even your children's names, your likes and your dislikes. I often said when I first had a class, I often used to say, I'm a season ticket holder at Newcastle United, which, you know, really seemed to get at least 2/3 of the students on side straight away. It kind of almost made a friend in you. So if you can make yourself human as often and early as possible, and that's really going to help build the relationships quicker, if you like. Trying to go straight into your rules, I think, you know, in your routines, this is what I expect of you, and I've got you for the next week or so. I think you're going to lose some students straight away. But again, that obviously depends on stage and setting. Tanya might have more answers on the primary side. I think, again, if you are doing it and you're coming in, knowing the school's behaviour policy and using it consistently is important, rather than just doing your own thing. Obviously, you have your strategies that you've built up over the time, maybe. But yeah, follow the policy, but don't overdo it at the same time. We've had supply teachers or cover teachers come in and try and follow the policy to the law straight away, right? Do. And then again, you can create enemies basically in a very short amount of time. And if you then are with that class for 2, 3, 4 weeks, perhaps, you've created those enemies which will cause problems for the whole time you are there. So that's my insight on it.
Yeah, I used to do some advisory work, so I was going into lots of different schools all around the different regions, and this really struck home with me of, yeah, I'm coming in as a total outsider to the school, so I have no idea about the systems, and quite often I would be left with a class, and you've got to maintain them. So that building relationship, and I would have the introduction of, I'm Miss Shields and we're going to be doing X, Y, and Z with you today. But in order for us to work well together, because I don't know your classroom rules, these are the type of things that would really help me if we can do these in the classroom. So if I want you to be listening, I'm going to say to you, can I have listening eyes? So that's when I say listening eyes, and we all know that listening eyes don't actually listen, but I don't know when your ears work. So can you all make sure that your eyes are on me, and then I know that you're listening? So I'd introduce my little sort of quirks and systems for making sure that I know that they're listening to me, because we haven't got that relationship, and being upfront about it, saying, I don't know how this works and this is how we can do it. Wendy's mentioned something about the behaviour posters and that she can't put them up in the classroom. Again, because I was going around lots of schools, I used to have little, just a sheet of A4 that was laminated and folded in half, and I could just stand it up like a card on the desk. So I wasn't, there weren't a massive pack, but if I did have those key things, then I could have listening eyes on one, and then whatever the rules I had on there. So I would just pop them up. And if I saw somebody behaving, somebody's spotted that rule, somebody's doing that, and back to that positive reinforcement. So sort of like a mini set of rules that you're putting in place, but not being overly, I don't know, I can't think of what the word was, Paul, but you touched on it in terms of supply teachers coming in and going, this is how we're going to behave. It's building that relationship quickly, and we're going to work as a team together so that we can get the work done and hopefully have an enjoyable time doing it as well.
Yeah, so you're not coming in too militant straight away, and trying to make yourself look almost befriend them without being their friend, but befriend them and show them that we're working together as a team on this. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, the next question is around de-escalation of a single student, and there's 4 or 5 questions that have come in that are very similar, and I'm going to pick out one from Helen. So it is, how do I help bring a child back from fight or flight without using too much of the lesson or losing the rest of the class? So it's around that fight or flight, and where a student can get to such a point where they perhaps are making it a bit of a dangerous environment, I suppose, in the way they're kicking off within the classroom. It's a difficult one, and one that I had to deal with quite often in the challenging school that I worked in. And I think you've got to look at it in 2 angles. And the way I would look at it is prior to fight or flight, which is about being aware of the student's mood and triggers and noticing if there's going to be an issue that could occur, and then during the fight. So in terms of prior to fight or flight, I think it's best that certain pupils can have a pass, if that's at all possible. Again, this I suppose is talking to the senior leadership within the school. Have some sort of pass that allow the students to use when you notice something is going wrong, or they themselves notice that they're not feeling in the right frame of mind. If they often do that fight or flight issue, and it, depending on your school circumstances and policy, that will allow them to cool off outside or go and see the pastoral leader or whatever the circumstances is. But that will hopefully stop the the fight or flight occurring. It lets them have that cooling off period before that. So that is really essential. And again, this is about relationships and knowing your students. So if you can see that this could occur, then what you need to do is preempt that and stop it occurring, because once it goes into fight or flight, it's very difficult to calm them down. A few questions were, how do I calm them down? It is very difficult to calm them down in that situation. Okay, so during the fight or flight, the priority is the safety of the other pupils in the class. Okay, and that out trumps learning, if you like. So avoid trying to calm down or stay calm, because that's probably going to ignite more. It usually ignites more in them. Instead, try and ask them to move to a safer space. Ask them to to breathe, perhaps. But at all instances, you need to keep the rest, the safety of the class paramount. And me and Tanya were speaking before, and she may want to elaborate. But so very often we used to remove the students out of the classroom so that we could deal with that one member of staff, because safety is key. Longer terms, if it continues to be a regular thing, I would encourage pastoral team to work with the student and outside agencies anywhere necessary to try and identify what the triggers are, and then working with the whole staff team to let them know how they can de-escalate before it becomes unmanageable. I think that was always something that we tried to work on our most challenging students, knowing exactly what it is that's causing that, knowing their background, knowing, you know, they come in on the morning and we just knew that little Joe is going to be difficult today because of the way he's walked in the building. And therefore, that's a case of, right, let's pick him up early and let's see what's wrong. And that, again, that sits outside of the teacher-specific work. A footnote to this, I suppose, if a child has a pass and if he's abusing it, there needs to be a strategy around that as well. We often had children that had one and then just out at every lesson, but I'll leave that bit for another day. Tanya?
Yeah, I think it's really key. It's about knowing your children, isn't it? This is the thing that used to make me most anxious, because I would quite often have these challenging children in my class. And I'm thinking of one child in particular who, if something was difficult for him in the classroom, and you mentioned about picking up on those triggers, he would almost orchestrate this eruption to, I think he would sometimes prefer getting told off to actually having to deal with the fact that he didn't understand what you were supposed to be learning. So it was trying to watch those triggers. And I remember once he was wandering around the classroom and the rest of the class had managed to ignore that. And he wrote on the whiteboard, "Miss Shields is a bag," to which, really not acceptable behaviour. And I just looked at him, I said, "You've spelt my name wrong." To which straight away he was like, that wasn't the response I was hoping for. And in that instance, it de-escalated it, because he went and sat back down, because my fear in the classroom was that he would erupt so much that I couldn't actually control his behavior, and then for the rest of the class it looks like they see it, and then I've lost control, and you can't have that in the classroom. So I had to learn very quickly what sanctions I could and couldn't put into place. I couldn't tell this child to leave the classroom when his behavior was becoming acceptable, because he would stand there and say, "No, make me." And the reality was I couldn't make him. So that child was an extreme, and we did have additional support in place. And I think there does come a point where you need to ask for the support within your school. So when he was kicking off, he was chucking things around the classroom, it was the safety of the other children that was important. So I sent one child, "Can you go and ask for," we had somebody who was working with this child, "Can you go and ask this member of staff to come and help, because this child needs some support?" And then I took the rest of the class out of the classroom, and we went onto the playground. But you can feel it in the pit of your stomach, that child's rising and it's going at 100 miles an hour. How do I deal with this? And just trying to keep you calm. And if you need to ask for additional support in terms of a member of staff, then do that, because you've got lots of other children to think about as well.
Lovely. Okay, we're moving on to unintended consequences of praise. I think we touched on it a little bit in a previous question. I'm just going to pick one out from Anna, who says, "How do you deal with pupils who do not appreciate praise or recognition, especially with their behaviour? For example, praising a child for making the right choices and then the child to throw back a comment back at you and run off." And there's also some questions around, well, other students, how they react to giving other students praise. So there is two elements to this question: students receiving praise and not dealing with that well, and other students not responding well when other students receive the praise. So the first one, as with a lot of behavior issues, and we've mentioned it quite a few times already, again, it is really knowing your children that's in front of you, and knowing their emotive triggers and knowing their background. Very often they have low self-esteem, attachment issues, or sometimes it's just bravado. They don't want other teachers or other students to see that you're getting praise from the teachers. So if you know that child reacts negatively to open and loud praise, then again, try a bit more of a personal approach, perhaps rewarding or giving them praise within their book. With younger children, I think Tanya will elaborate more, but perhaps like a star chart within their book, etc., that sort of thing. So that they don't get that embarrassed feel, that shame feel that perhaps they're feeling when they get praise from an adult because of their background. If any sort of praise, regardless of setting, can cause an issue, again, as this is all background in setting dependent, you really need to know that child. Sometimes you can give them praise in a lot of different ways: phone call home, postcards. You can let the parents know so that they can praise them. But again, that is all background dependent. One that used to always work in our school where we had children like this was to know which member of staff did have the great relationship with them, that they would take that praise from, and letting them know and just say, he's done something really, really good today. Can you let them know that I noticed that? And then they could have that conversation with them. That really does work, because they understand that you've seen the improvement without that embarrassed feel that they may have. Keeping the praise for a time or he or she will accept it again. So we've mentioned this before. Outside the classroom, you could go over and say, yesterday in that classroom, I'd seen what you did when you helped Dylan. Really appreciated that. And again, that just takes the sort of whole class saying that, and hopefully they'll respond positively to that. But like everything, you have to know that child and know what they will appreciate and what they won't appreciate. And the second one comes back to some of the key skills of behaviour management over time. So you just have to, so when other students are not reacting well because they're not getting the praise, you just have to be consistent and fair with the praise in the classroom. And I think Vicky made some real good comments on that. It's about relentlessly assuring those children that they are important and that you care about them as well, even if you're giving other people praise. Because obviously that's self-esteem issues as well, causing that envy. Tanya.
Yeah, I'm not going to elaborate much more on that, because we're beginning to sound like a broken record. It's about knowing your children and knowing how they're going to respond, and being genuine with your praise, because if it's not sincere, then the children see through that. I did just think of another strategy of maybe sending a letter home to the parents, or just catching the parents at the end of the day to say, they've done really well today. Could you just let them know, that type of thing, so they get the pride at home. But it's knowing your children and know what works for them. And if it doesn't work, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just take that as a learning point. And one day some of these strategies are going to work, and one day then they're not. So it is sticking with it, and it's a long process. But don't become disheartened if it doesn't work the first time.
Okay, we're moving on swiftly to the next question, which was around students reacting to behaviour management approaches and seeing a level of unfairness around it. So there's a question from Nicholas. As someone has already said, some children are viewed as getting away with more, but they may have different or more limited level of understanding, so they have to be viewed by other children, and they seem to be getting away with something, which causes that unfairness because they see inequality within the classroom. So yeah, this one really is important to me at the minute, because I'm contending with that in home environment with my 2-year-old and my 6-year-old. So my 6-year-old is struggling to understand why the 2-year-old gets slightly different treatment when he is misbehaving. And it's hard to explain to them that it has to be different. So this is all, again, personal view. So what I try to do is explain to them, and this would work in a school environment, is you shouldn't really be measuring yourself per se against your peers or those who are younger, especially those peers who often seem to be getting it wrong. What you need to try and do is think of a role model and start measuring yourself about how they would react to things. So how would that person react to that situation? How would that person respond to that challenge? So that they're not measuring themselves on someone who's getting it wrong. Again, as much as possible, you should be consistent in following the school policies with those children. They can't seem to be getting away with it. And I know it's not always possible, and I know there's tough circumstances that the children are coming from and the background they're coming from. And as I said before, when they've come into the building in a certain mood, and therefore you have to think about the way you approach things, but they still are misbehaving, and therefore they still need to have the consequences at the end of that. So yeah, you need to be as consistent and as fair as you possibly can, but just keeping in mind how to approach that with the student in question. Perhaps you could follow the policy calmly and then have the discussion with the child later around that. If children do start to question it, again, I would say, where you need to go forward to be successful, we don't want you to slip. So we support you if you get it wrong. Whereas with some other students, we know they get it wrong often, so we're supporting them in getting it right. Okay, that's how I often try to explain to those students who felt that they were being picked on because they are being dealt with maybe more severely than others because this is the first time they've done something wrong per se. So it was always a case of, well, we know that you are where you need to be, and therefore if you get it wrong, we're putting you right. Whereas with the other students, it's the other way around. Tanya?
Yeah, I've got my mum's voice ringing in my ears about when I used to say it's not fair, and she'd turn to me and say, Tanya, you'll soon learn life isn't fair. It's just kind of, oh, great, thanks for that. But again, using the example, the child that I spoke about before, I had to be upfront with the class. And when he was out doing something else, say, and if it came up in conversation, or we'd maybe planned some PSHE activities, we talk about the fact that we are all different and relate it to maybe academic ability as well. So, well, so-and-so's better at maths than you are, and you're judged on different levels because of that. And it's the same with behaviour. And actually, we are all trying as a class to be better and to work together. And if we can help this child to actually improve, then that's our responsibility as well. So making it sort of a collective approach, but being upfront with the children, as I'm sure you are with your 2-year-old and your 6-year-old, and saying, well, yes, but you know better and you know how you should behave, and I'm sorry that you feel it's unfair, but it sounds like I'm being a bit flippant there, but I think honesty is the best policy with that one, because there isn't a quick fix, because as we all know, we do treat these children, they do seem to get away with more than the better behaved children. And trying to explain to a young child in the long run, you can't do. So there isn't a quick fix, but it did have some improvements, talking to the children, helping them to understand that we are all different and taking it from that point of view.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to go down the verbal abuse one, I think, which is the one that we have left that is very different to the rest, if that's okay. So yeah, very often the question is from Christine, who says, as a probationer teacher, I had an incident in the class where I had a child who was being disruptive out of their seat and throwing things. When I asked them to leave the classroom, they told me to F off in front of the rest of the class. How would you advise a teacher to deal with this situation? In this instance, it was primary school aged 8. Obviously, I'm secondary background. It happens a lot, far more often in the secondary setting. You know, it's one of my favorites actually. So being head of behaviour in a challenging school, it was a daily occurrence where a member of staff would come up to me and just say, "He's told me to F off." And I think the first thing to remember is, and this is key, it is not personal. It is absolutely not personal. No matter how personal it feels, it's not. And it always needs to be responded to without emotion. You're the adult, so don't go back to them. Obviously, you would never swear back at them, but don't try and argue with them at that point. It's you need to keep yourself out of that situation a little bit. Again, it obviously all depends on the school's policy about how that should be dealt with. And obviously, different schools have different policies around swearing and abusive language. So yeah, often it would be asking the child to go and leave and go to the relevant place. So in my school, we had what we called a timeout. So if something like that would happen, they would go down to the inclusion centre, if you like, to have a bit of timeout, and then it can be dealt with at a later date. But what needs to happen, I think, at that point is what I used to do and ask myself to do is, don't say anything while the child is leaving the room. You don't want to flare up even more. But just so the other children in the room know, you're basically saying, I'm going to deal with that child later. Let's get back to learning. So they know that it's not a big deal in terms of the classroom situation. We're going to get back to learning, and you are going to go away and deal with that child later. But it goes back to the point, you will have to go back and deal with that child later, or get someone to deal with that child later relentlessly, and over time they will know you'll never let that lie. And another thing, you need to be clear on the school's policy, what it is, because very often staff expected too much of a consequence on the students within my school. We had to make it very clear what was abusive language towards staff. And again, I come from a very challenging school, so the word F off isn't abusive to staff, whereas saying something like "you are an effing so and so" is. And then there is definitely a different consequence to that. So you just need to be clear on that, and staff need to be aware of what is and what isn't. And again, that all depends on the school's policy with that. But the key thing from that is, and I go back to it, it is not personal, and you have to deal with it in a non-emotive way.
Yeah, it really isn't personal, is it? It's quite often these children will be hearing this language as commonplace at home, and I remember seeing some children in an art lesson, and they were sat next to each other, and somebody had mixed the wrong colour painted with something else, and it was like, "Oh, you're effing this," and he didn't do it as an aggressive thing. It was with his mate. I overheard it. He caught my eye, and I just said, "I don't think that's appropriate conversation for the classroom." Again, if it's been directed to the teacher and that child left, I would be very clear once that child had left and was out of earshot, to then speak to the class and say that really wasn't acceptable behaviour, and that child is going to be dealt with after they've done the lesson, after we've finished this lesson, so that the rest of the children know what those expectations are. I just want to try and link in the last question from Chloe there around EYFS, and kind of how you actually reward better behaviour. And I think that it wraps it up nicely with what we've been saying throughout this whole Q&A session. It's about knowing your children and knowing what triggers are going to work for them. And that's exactly the same for your EYFS. So just thinking of my little girl who's 3.5, if it's Paw Patrol, then that's going to be the trigger. Try and give her Peppa Pig, she's not interested. So I would say for EYFS, it's getting to know your child and maybe speaking to your parents of what rewards would actually help. Maybe it is 5 minutes in the dressing up area, or maybe it is a sticker, or maybe it is I'm going to send this letter home to your parents. But it is all about relationships, and these things take time, and it's being consistent and making sure that you stick to whatever the plan was, and what your school plan is, and helping these children to actually fit in with the normal classroom life.
Thank you, Tanya. And that concludes our question and answer session today. I just want to summarize very quickly some of the key things that we said, and some of the key things I always try to get across to members of my team. First and foremost, it's always about relationships and knowing the child, what makes them tick, and what are their triggers. You should never have emotion in dealing with it. It's not personal. You need to be consistent and persistent in following through, and you need to follow through relentlessly. And on the back of that, never threaten something that you wouldn't then do. That's a key one. And what I always try to get across is every day is a new day. When that child comes back into your classroom, it is a fresh slate. You are the adult. You should be treating them like every other child. There should not be any grudge. Another one is positive every time. Always be positive. Don't be thinking, "Oh, here comes Joe Blogs. It's going to be a nightmare." Positive, 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 and go from there. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to us.